Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. My name is Wesley, and this is a show where we are slowly cooking our way through all of the food from my childhood. Today we're diving back into our series dedicated to Filipino comfort food classics with a shot at the aptly named Filipino spaghetti, inspired of course by the one and only version found at Jollibee's. Now, before we dive in, let's start by acknowledging that Filipino spaghetti is an incredibly divisive concept by its very nature. Many folks watching here, I would guess, have a lot of questions already. What in the world is Filipino spaghetti? Dear God, is that a hot dog? And how much sugar is too much sugar to add to a bolognese sauce? Fear not, y'all, I have answers to all of these questions and more. A Filipino spaghetti is, at the risk of once again angering every single Italian on the internet, at its core not too dissimilar from a pretty traditional bolognese sauce. It's a tomato-based meat sauce with a foundation built on top of sofrito-based veggie elements, then slow simmered with aromatic spices like nutmeg and bay leaf, yielding a deeply rich and flavorful sauce. What makes it particularly unique, however, is that the Filipino spaghetti iconically contains two, let's call them controversial elements. The first being sliced hot dog, and the second being a half cup of white sugar, giving it the colloquial name sugar spaghetti. So, this means for our version today, we'll be exploring fundamentally how to make a bolognese sauce, then followed just by every single way there is to anger people on the internet. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so diving right in, we're kicking things off here first with the core vegetable elements that will go on to form the base of our sauce today. In traditional Italian cooking, you may see this referred to as sofrito, comprised specifically of carrots, onion, and celery. For our Filipino version today, we are instead going with 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic, followed by half of a medium white onion, small diced as well. In hindsight, I see no real reason why we couldn't have gone with a more traditional sofrito here, although I will say that the addition of garlic is going to be pretty critical later on. Next up, this is 2 cups of beef stock that I'm reconstituting, followed as promised by 4 hot dogs that I'm slicing up on a bias. Now, before folks lose their minds, my thought process here is that a hot dog is essentially just a sausage. So we're treating this in the same way that we would treat a sausage in a spaghetti, which is to say slicing it with as much surface area exposed as possible so that we may bloom out the aromatic fats and spices inside of the casing as we can later on. Last up, moving on, this is 8 ounces or half a pound each of 80/20 ground beef and ground pork that I'm preparing. This, in my opinion, is one of the most critical steps in elevating a mediocre bolognese to a really great one. We're taking a few extra steps today to help develop fond for our ground meat, or in other words, the caramelized bits left on the pan after something is fried. I'm doing this today by rolling our ground meat into golf ball sized balls so that we may maximize the surface area contact of the ground meat on the pot. These don't really have to be perfectly shaped because we're of course going to break them apart later, but I am looking for roughly 12 to 16 balls in total though. Over on the stove, I have a medium-sized Dutch oven that I'm heating up over medium-low heat, then adding about a 1/4 cup of olive oil so that we may sear our ground meat. Yes, believe it or not, I do own a low-heat oil, y'all, although I do think that this might be the first time that we have ever used olive oil on this channel. We're searing our ground meat for about 2 to 3 minutes before rotating, repeating, and removing from the pot. These don't need to be fully cooked at this point. Obviously, there's a very long simmer coming up to address the actual cook here. Rather, what we're looking for instead is a nicely developed browning, not just to the meat, but also, more importantly, to the fats and fond left behind on the bottom of the pot. This is what we're looking for here. I'm following this up with our veggie elements into our now empty pot. This is my onion and garlic going in, seasoned with a pinch of kosher salt and sauteed for about 2 minutes until slightly translucent. Then next, here's my hot dogs going in. As I mentioned earlier, we're treating these as if they were sausages, which means that the low and slow heat from our Dutch oven paired with the large exposed surface area of our hot dog is going to allow us to render out a lot of aromatics from the hot dog. We're letting this go for about 3 to 4 minutes until lightly sauteed, then removing and returning our ground beef and ground pork back to the pot. I'm using a potato masher here to start breaking these balls down into a pebbly minced meat texture, then clearing some surface area in the pot so that we may begin adding 2 tablespoons of tomato paste directly onto the cooking surface. This is important with tomato paste in particular because it's a concentrated paste which has a pretty tinny and metallic aftertaste to it unless you properly cook it off, like so. Finally, we're ready to move on to our deglaze and simmer. This is half a cup of white wine that I'm adding in first, not only to deglaze the bottom of the pot, but also cook off a lot of the alcohol in the wine as well. Then next, here's my hot dogs and veggies going back into the pot, followed by our simmering elements. This is 16 ounces of tomato sauce, followed by 2 cups of beef stock and about a cup of water mixed to combine, then covered and simmered for 2 to 4 hours. While this simmers on our side burner, I'm bringing a pot of water to boil for our pasta next. I'm seasoning this with about a half a cup of kosher salt first, then cooking our spaghetti to package instruction, and of course reserving about a cup of pasta water for later. If you have not yet considered trying to cook your dried pastas in a smaller sized pot, this is your cue to do so. As you may notice, the smaller pot yields a more condensed and starchier pasta water, which is going to be a pretty critical element later on. Circling back to our bolognese here, this is about 30 to 45 minutes into the simmer, where I'm adding about a half teaspoon of freshly grated nutmeg, as well as 2 bay leaves that I forgot to film, and half a cup of white sugar going into our pot.
This is a terrible idea.
Anyway, once we're ready to serve, I'm seasoning my sauce here with kosher salt to taste, then adding my pasta to the pot, followed by our reserved pasta water to help thicken the sauce. Finally, I'm finishing this off with some shredded cheese, and we're ready to eat. Okay, so look, I know that there are a lot of things to be mad about here. Some are more obvious than others. Really, I think the addition of garlic is maybe even more egregious than the hot dogs, ? To be absolutely honest though, I would say about 80% of what we just assembled is a pretty straightforward bolognese technique. This includes the development of fond, the white wine deglaze, the vegetable base, the long simmer, and so on. I will also add that I have had a lot of Jollibee and or Filipino spaghetti in my life, and for the most part it truly has been a pretty underwhelming experience. But I think really what makes these versions of this dish so mediocre is not the hot dogs and sugar, it's actually that there's just not very much attention to detail. The pasta is often overcooked, and the sauce lacks a depth of flavor, leaving it tinny, metallic, or just plain sugary. After giving our version a little bit more attention to detail though, honestly this is a pretty good sauce for the most part, created by a simple attention to detail. There's a deep richness to our sauce that comes from the long simmer, then there's brightness from our deglaze, and even some nice aromatics from our hot dogs. Now, I will say that in preparation of this, I did pretty intentionally dial back the sugar content so that all of these flavors would have a nice chance to stand out a bit. This said though, I do actually understand the appeal of the sweetness too. I think it complements the richness of the bolognese nicely, provided that we're not dumping like 2 whole cups of white sugar in, which I've seen happen in a lot of similar recipes. So, look, I'm not saying that your noni is going to approve of this, but you know, if you haven't tried throwing a bunch of sugar and hot dogs into your pasta sauce yet, you're kind of missing out. Okay, so that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you give this one a shot. For those who are new to the channel, this one is part of a larger series dedicated to classic Filipino dishes, so definitely check out that series next if you haven't yet, because there's a lot of these. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share, be nice interneters, and I'll see you soon.